A preacher walks into an orphanage for a routine visit, until a desperate little girl grabs his hand and pleads, "Please adopt me." His heart stops. Those eyes, too familiar. Then the truth shatters him. She's his granddaughter, the child of the daughter he abandoned. Her mother is gone forever, and now the only piece of her left is begging for a home. But does he deserve a second chance? And will she ever forgive him? What happens next will leave you breathless. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The morning sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows of Grace Community Church, casting kaleidoscope patterns across the polished wooden pews. Pastor Thomas Brooks stood at the pulpit, his silver hair catching the light, his weathered hands gripping the worn leather Bible he'd carried for 20 years. The gold-leafed pages were soft from countless hours of study, marked with sticky notes and underlined verses that had guided both him and his congregation. The church members sat in rapt attention, their faces turned up toward him like flowers seeking the sun. "Forgiveness," he began, his deep voice carrying to every corner of the sanctuary, "is at the heart of our faith." The word felt like ash in his mouth, bitter and dry. It's not just about receiving God's forgiveness, but about extending that same grace to others and to ourselves. His chest tightened around each word. His fingers trembled slightly as he turned the page, the familiar rustle of thin paper filling the quiet space. 300 pairs of eyes watched him, trusting him, believing in him. If they only knew. The weight of his collar felt heavy against his throat like a reminder of promises unkept. In Matthew 6:14, Jesus tells us, "For if you forgive other people when they sin against you, your heavenly Father will also forgive you." Thomas paused, swallowing hard. The irony wasn't lost on him. Here he stood, preaching about forgiveness while his own unforgiven sin sat like a stone in his chest, growing heavier with each passing year. The congregation nodded, several people murmuring "Amen." In the back pew, a teenage girl with long brown hair sat alone, her head bowed, fingers fidgeting with the hem of her dress. Thomas's voice caught for a moment. She reminded him so much of Sarah. His Sarah. The way she used to sit in church before everything fell apart. As the service ended, people filed forward to shake his hand, forming their usual line of Sunday morning well-wishers. "Beautiful message, Pastor Thomas," Mrs. Henderson said, her eyes misting. "Just what I needed to hear today." Her floral perfume lingered in the air between them. "That was powerful, Pastor," another woman added, squeezing his arm. "You have such a way with words." Each compliment landed like a small cut on his conscience. Thomas smiled and nodded, going through the motions like a well-rehearsed play, shaking hands and offering blessings. Each compliment felt like a small cut. If they knew how he'd turned his back on his own daughter when she needed him most, would they still look at him with such admiration? Would their smiles turn to judgment? The teenage girl slipped out without speaking to anyone, her sneakers squeaking softly on the polished floor. Thomas watched her go, his heart heavy with memories of another girl, another time, another chance at love that he'd thrown away. The sound of the heavy wooden doors closing behind her echoed through the now emptying sanctuary. The drive home in his old Buick was silent except for the familiar rattle of the engine. He gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white, trying to focus on the road instead of the echoes of his sermon bouncing around his mind. "Hypocrite," his conscience whispered. "How dare you preach about forgiveness?" The autumn trees blurred past his windows, their colors as muted as his spirit. His house stood dark and empty, just like it had for the past 18 years. No welcome home hugs, no family photos on the walls, no sounds of laughter. Just silence and regret, his constant companions. The floorboards creaked beneath his feet as he made his way inside, each step a reminder of his solitary life. In his study, Thomas pulled open the bottom drawer of his desk, the wood groaning in protest. Beneath a stack of old sermon notes lay a photograph, worn at the edges from years of handling. Sarah's 16-year-old face smiled up at him, her eyes bright with youth and hope, her whole life ahead of her. That was before the pregnancy test, before the shouting, before he'd chosen his reputation over his own flesh and blood. "I'm sorry, baby girl," he whispered to the photograph, his voice rough with emotion. But photographs couldn't grant absolution, and Sarah's frozen smile offered no forgiveness. The lamplight cast long shadows across his study as he sat there, holding the only piece of his daughter he had left, the paper smooth and familiar beneath his trembling fingers. In the growing darkness, Thomas closed his eyes, but sleep wouldn't come. The regret was too loud, drowning out everything else. His sermon about forgiveness echoed mockingly in his mind, each word a reminder of his failure not as a pastor but as a father. The clock on the wall ticked away the minutes, counting down another day without his daughter. The morning sun cast long shadows through the tall windows of St. Mary's Home for Children. Thomas parked his car in the nearly empty lot, the check from his church tucked safely in his jacket pocket. He'd made this same trip dozens of times over the years, always keeping his visits brief and businesslike, never allowing himself to linger longer than necessary. The building showed its age, paint peeling at the corners, window frames that needed attention, concrete steps worn smooth from countless footsteps. But someone had tried to brighten the place up. Colorful murals decorated the walls. Rainbow landscapes, smiling animals, and stick figure families holding hands. A butterfly made of children's handprints spread its wings across one wall. Children's laughter echoed down the hallway, a sound that usually brought him comfort but today made his chest feel tight and his shoulders tense. "Pastor Brooks," a familiar voice called out. Margaret Lewis strode toward him, her practical shoes clicking against the worn linoleum floor. Her silver-streaked hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and despite the early hour, she looked ready to tackle whatever challenges the day might bring. Her warm smile didn't quite mask the concerned look in her eyes. "Right on time, as always." Thomas managed to smile, reaching for the check with slightly trembling fingers. "Just doing my part, Margaret. The congregation sends their best wishes. We appreciate your continued support." Margaret's keen eyes studied his face, noting the dark circles under his eyes and the way he wouldn't quite meet her gaze. "Would you like to see what we've done with the library? The new books your last donation helped purchase?" "Perhaps another time," Thomas said quickly, already turning toward the exit, his shoes squeaking against the floor. "I have a busy schedule today." That's when it happened. Small fingers grabbed his hand, warm and insistent, catching him mid-stride. Thomas looked down, startled, into a pair of brown eyes that seemed to pierce straight into his soul, past all his carefully constructed walls. "Please, please adopt me." The little girl's voice trembled with desperation, her grip surprisingly strong for someone so small. Her words hung in the air between them, raw and honest. Thomas felt the air leave his lungs in a rush. The child wore a purple sweater that hung loose on her thin frame, the sleeves rolled up several times, the fabric worn soft at the elbows. Her brown hair was messy, as if she'd been running, and a few strands stuck to her forehead with perspiration. But it was her eyes, those haunting, familiar eyes, that made his world tilt sideways, sending him reeling back through time. Sarah's eyes, his daughter's eyes, the same shape, the same shade of warm brown, even the same tiny flecks of gold near the pupils. "I dot." The word caught in his throat like a physical thing. His hand started shaking in the little girl's grip, cold sweat breaking out on his forehead. One of the staff members hurried forward, her face apologetic, shoes squeaking on the floor. "Emma, sweetie, you can't do that to visitors." She reached for the child, but Emma only held on tighter, her small fingers digging into Thomas's palm. "You're supposed to take me home," Emma whispered, her voice so soft Thomas almost missed it, but carrying the weight of absolute certainty. The words hit him like a physical blow, making him stumble back slightly, his free hand reaching blindly for support. He tried to pull his hand away gently, but his movements felt clumsy, uncoordinated, as if his body belonged to someone else. The room seemed to spin slightly, memories of Sarah crashing over him like waves, her same desperate expression the night he'd turned her away, pregnant and terrified at 16, standing in the rain on their front porch. "Pastor?" Margaret's voice cut through his panic, sharp and clear. She stepped closer, her brow furrowed with concern, one hand hovering near his elbow. "Are you all right?" Thomas managed a jerky nod, finally freeing his hand from Emma's grip. His palm felt cold where her warm fingers had been, like a brand of ice against his skin. He swallowed hard, trying to find his voice, but the words wouldn't come. The floor beneath his feet didn't feel solid anymore, as if the ground itself was shifting under the weight of this moment, this impossible coincidence. Margaret's frown deepened as she watched his face drain of color, her years of experience telling her something significant was happening. "Perhaps you should sit down for a moment." The afternoon light had faded to a dull gray, matching Thomas's mood as he sat in Margaret Lewis's cramped office. Filing cabinets lined the walls, stuffed with papers that represented hundreds of children's stories. Hundreds of lives touched by loss and hope. The ancient desk lamp cast shadows across Margaret's face as she studied him with careful eyes, her decades of experience helping her read the turmoil beneath his carefully maintained facade. Thomas's hands wouldn't stop shaking. He'd spent the last few hours driving aimlessly around town, past familiar streets that now seemed strange and distant, trying to make sense of what he'd felt when Emma grabbed his hand. Those eyes, Sarah's eyes, haunted him, following him wherever he went. "Tell me about the girl, Emma." His voice came out rougher than he intended, scratchy with emotion. Margaret leaned back in her chair, her expression guarded, her fingers laced together on the desk. "Why the sudden interest, Pastor Brooks?" He struggled to find the right words, his throat tight with unspoken truths. How could he explain the jolt of recognition he'd felt? The way his heart had nearly stopped when Emma looked up at him. "Please," was all he could manage, the word carrying the weight of 2 decades of regret. Margaret watched him for a long moment, then sighed, the sound heavy with understanding. She reached for a manila folder from the stack on her desk, opening it with practiced care. "Emma came to us about 8 months ago," she began, but Thomas barely heard her, his pulse thundering in his ears, his eyes locked onto the document in front of her. There, in black and white, was a name he hadn't allowed himself to speak in years: Sarah Brooks. Mother's name, Sarah Brooks. Deceased. The clinical formality of the words made them somehow more devastating. The world tilted sideways, reality shifting beneath his feet. Thomas gripped the edge of the desk, his knuckles turning white, the wood grain rough under his fingers. The words blurred before his eyes, but they were burned into his mind like brands. Cancer. Terminal. No known relatives contacted. "Why?" His voice cracked like thin ice. He had to start again, forcing the words past the lump in his throat. "Why didn't anyone tell me?" Margaret's expression softened with compassion, but her words cut like a knife, sharp with truth. "Did she know how to find you, Pastor?" The question hit him like a physical blow, driving the air from his lungs. Of course she hadn't known how to find him. He'd made sure of that, hadn't he? When Sarah had come to him, scared and pregnant at 16, he'd turned her away. Told her not to come back until she'd fixed her mistake. He'd been so concerned about his reputation, about what his congregation would think, that he'd forgotten to be concerned about his own daughter. The silence in the office grew thick, heavy with unspoken accusations and years of missed opportunities. Thomas couldn't breathe. The walls seemed to close in around him, the weight of his past pressing down like a physical thing. He pushed himself up suddenly, his chair scraping against the floor with a harsh sound that echoed his internal turmoil. And then, in front of Margaret Lewis, the mask he'd worn for so many years cracked completely. His legs gave out, and he collapsed back into the chair, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. All the guilt, all the regret he'd carried for 23 years poured out of him in waves of grief that seemed endless. "My baby girl," he choked out between sobs, his voice raw and broken. "My Sarah. She died alone. She died thinking I didn't..." He couldn't finish the sentence, the words too painful to voice. His daughter had died believing he didn't love her. And now her daughter, his granddaughter, was here, alone, just like Sarah had been, carrying the weight of abandonment he'd started so many years ago. Margaret sat quietly, her presence steady and understanding, allowing him this moment of breakdown, this long overdue reckoning with his past. The ticking of the wall clock marked each second of his grief, each moment of painful revelation. The grandfather clock in the hallway struck midnight, its deep chimes echoing through Thomas's empty house like mournful reminders of his solitude. He sat in his study, surrounded by darkness except for the warm glow of his old desk lamp, which cast long shadows across the worn carpet. His hands wouldn't stop trembling as he stared at the adoption papers Margaret had given him earlier that day, the crisp white pages stark against his dark wooden desk. "What am I supposed to do?" he whispered to the empty room, his voice catching in his throat. The silence offered no answers, only the soft ticking of the clock marking time's relentless march forward. With unsteady fingers, he pulled open his bottom desk drawer and lifted out a weathered wooden box, its surface smooth from years of handling. The hinges creaked as he opened it, revealing decades of memories he'd tried to forget but couldn't bring himself to destroy. Photos, birthday cards, little treasures from a life he'd thrown away, and beneath them all, a folded piece of paper that made his heart ache with each beat. Sarah's last letter. The paper felt fragile in his hands, worn thin from the countless times he'd unfolded and refolded it over the years, like a penitent's prayer repeated endlessly. Her handwriting, once so familiar, now seemed to blur before his eyes as his vision clouded with unshed tears. "I'll raise my baby without you." The words hit him like a physical blow just as they had 15 years ago, leaving him breathless and aching. He remembered that day with painful clarity. Sarah standing in this very study, tears streaming down her face as she told him she was pregnant. Her hands had been clasped protectively over her stomach, already shielding her unborn child. He'd been so angry, so concerned about his reputation as a pastor, that he'd forgotten to be a father first. "You've brought shame to this family," he'd thundered, standing behind his desk like a judge passing sentence. "What will the congregation think?" Sarah's voice had been quiet but firm, steady despite her tears. "I don't care what they think. This is my baby." "Then get out." The words had torn from his throat before he could stop them, harsh and final like a door slamming shut. The sound of the front door slamming still echoed in his nightmares, a constant reminder of the moment he'd chosen pride over love. Thomas pressed his palms against his eyes, trying to hold back tears that insisted on falling anyway. "I'm sorry, baby girl," he whispered into the darkness, his voice breaking. "I'm so sorry." But Sarah would never hear his apology. She was gone, taken by cancer before he could make things right, before he could tell her how wrong he'd been. And now Emma, her daughter, his granddaughter, was alone in that orphanage, with Sarah's eyes and Sarah's determination, waiting for someone to choose her. The adoption papers seemed to mock him from his desk, their blank spaces gaping like wounds. Could he do this? Did he deserve another chance at family after throwing away his first one? He was 58 years old, set in his ways, living alone in a house full of regrets. What did he know about raising a child? But those eyes, Emma's eyes, had pierced straight through to his soul when she'd grabbed his hand in the orphanage's visiting room. "Please adopt me," she'd said with Sarah's directness, as if she somehow knew they were connected by more than chance. The clock struck again, 1, 2, 3 times, 3 a.m. Thomas hadn't moved from his chair, trapped between the ghost of his past mistakes and the possibility of redemption that lay before him in black and white on the adoption forms. His coffee had gone cold hours ago, forgotten like so many other things. The silence in the room felt oppressive, pressing in on him from all sides. But inside his mind, he was screaming at his younger self for being so foolish, so proud, so certain of his righteousness. Screaming at the years he'd wasted waiting for Sarah to come back. Screaming at the chance he might be about to waste again, all because of fear. The adoption papers waited patiently on his desk, blank lines ready for his signature, ready for his decision. Ready for him to either embrace this second chance or let it slip away like he had with Sarah. The pen lay beside them, gleaming in the lamplight like a key waiting to unlock a future he never expected to have. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of St. Mary's Home for Children, casting rainbow patterns on the worn linoleum floor. Thomas stood in the doorway of the playroom, his heart pounding against his ribs. In his hand, he clutched a small brown teddy bear, its fur soft and new against his sweaty palm. He'd spent the entire drive here rehearsing what to say, but now all his practiced words seemed hollow. The playroom buzzed with activity. Kids chased each other around wooden tables, their laughter bouncing off walls decorated with bright murals of giraffes and elephants. A toy truck zoomed past his feet, followed by two giggling boys. But Emma sat alone in the corner, her small frame hunched over a coloring book. Her dark hair fell forward, hiding her face as she concentrated on her drawing, seemingly content in her solitude. Thomas took a deep breath and walked toward her. His footsteps felt heavy, each one carrying the weight of years of regret. Some of the children glanced his way. The pastor was a familiar sight at the orphanage, but never in the playroom. A little girl with pigtails waved at him before returning to her block tower. "Hello, Emma," he said softly, his voice barely audible above the playroom chaos. She looked up, her brown eyes, Sarah's eyes, widening slightly in surprise. The crayon in her hand stopped mid-stroke. "You came back?" Thomas nodded, holding out the teddy bear. It was nothing special, just something he'd picked up at the corner store that morning. But he'd spent 20 minutes choosing it, wanting it to be perfect. The bear's gentle smile and warm brown fur had reminded him of Sarah's favorite childhood toy. Emma didn't reach for it. Instead, she set down her crayon and looked directly at him, her gaze unnervingly steady for a 7-year-old. Her small fingers played with the edge of her coloring book. "Are you here because you want me? Or because you feel bad?" The question hit Thomas like a physical blow. His mouth went dry. In the harsh fluorescent light of the playroom, surrounded by cheerful drawings and scattered toys, he felt exposed. The truth was, he didn't know the answer himself. Was he here out of genuine desire or crushing guilt? Was there even a difference anymore? The sounds of children playing seemed to fade into the background as he struggled with his conscience. Emma waited for his response, her face unreadable, shoulders tense beneath her faded blue sweater. When none came, she shrugged and finally took the bear, setting it beside her coloring book. Without another word, she returned to her drawing, though her strokes seemed more forceful now. Thomas pulled up a tiny plastic chair and sat down, his knees nearly touching his chest. The chair creaked under his weight, drawing curious glances from nearby children. He watched as Emma's crayon moved across the paper with careful strokes. Gradually, an image emerged, a woman with long, flowing hair. His throat tightened as he recognized Sarah's features taking shape under Emma's small hands. Each stroke seemed deliberate, as if Emma was trying to preserve a memory she was afraid of losing. From across the room, Margaret Lewis stood in the doorway, her arms crossed. He could feel her watchful gaze, evaluating his every move. She'd seen too many well-meaning adults come and go, leaving broken promises in their wake. Her expression held a mix of concern and cautious hope. After several minutes of silence, Thomas rose from the uncomfortable chair. His joints protested the movement, reminding him of his age. The plastic chair had left red marks on the backs of his legs. "I'll be back tomorrow," he said, trying to inject certainty into his voice. Emma didn't look up from her drawing. "If you say so," she muttered, reaching for a different crayon. Her small hand hovered over the blues and greens before selecting a deep purple. Thomas walked out of the playroom, his footsteps echoing in the hallway. The teddy bear he'd brought sat untouched beside Emma's coloring book, already forgotten. He wondered if he'd already failed, if he was destined to disappoint another generation of his family. Behind him, the sounds of children playing grew fainter, but Emma's words echoed in his mind, a challenge he wasn't sure he could meet. The law office of David Carter felt like stepping into another century. Dark mahogany panels lined the walls, and leather-bound law books filled floor-to-ceiling shelves, their gold-lettered spines gleaming softly in the afternoon light. The air smelled of old paper and furniture polish, with just a hint of coffee from somewhere down the hall. Thomas sat in a high-backed chair, his hands folded in his lap to hide their trembling, the leather cushion creaking softly beneath him. David Carter, a man with salt and pepper hair and wire-rimmed glasses that caught the light from his desk lamp, studied the documents spread across his desk. His face remained neutral, but Thomas could see the slight furrow in his brow deepening as he read, his finger occasionally tracing a line of text. "Let me understand this clearly," David said, looking up from the papers and removing his glasses to polish them with a cloth from his desk drawer. "You're Emma's biological grandfather, but you haven't been in contact with the family for—" He glanced down again, settling his glasses back on his nose. 7 years. Thomas's throat felt dry as sandpaper. "Yes, I made terrible mistakes with my daughter, Sarah. I turned her away when she needed me most." His voice cracked slightly on the last word. David leaned back in his chair, his expression stern, the leather squeaking beneath him. "Pastor Brooks, I'll be direct with you. The family court system isn't particularly forgiving, especially in cases involving past family abandonment. They've seen too many hollow promises." Thomas pulled out a folder from his briefcase, the sound of the zipper unnaturally loud in the quiet office. His hands shook slightly as he placed several documents on the desk, carefully arranging them. "I brought my financial records, background check, and property deed. I can provide character references from prominent community members." "That's a start," David said, but his tone remained skeptical, his fingers drumming lightly on his desk. He picked up the financial records, scanning them quickly, the papers rustling in his hands. "Your finances are stable, and your position in the community is certainly favorable. But—" He set the papers down and looked Thomas directly in the eyes, his gaze unwavering. "The courts will want to know why they should trust you with a child when you abandoned your own daughter." The words hit Thomas like physical blows, each one landing with devastating accuracy. He gripped the armrests of his chair, his knuckles turning white. "I know I failed Sarah. I can't change that, but I can be there for Emma. I have to try." The last words came out as barely more than a whisper. David pulled out a thick stack of forms from a drawer, the sound of shuffling paper filling the room. "We'll need to file these immediately. The process will be lengthy, and there's no guarantee of success." He started marking spots for signatures with yellow tabs, the sticky notes making tiny scratching sounds as he placed them. "You'll need to prove you're committed to Emma's well-being. This isn't just about blood relation or financial stability." "I understand," Thomas said, reaching for the pen David offered, its weight feeling unusually heavy in his hand. "The home study will be rigorous," David continued, straightening papers with practiced movements. "They'll examine every aspect of your life. Your past decisions will be scrutinized. Are you prepared for that?" Thomas nodded, signing where indicated. Each signature felt like both a promise and a prayer, the scratch of the pen against paper marking moments of commitment. As he finished the last form, David gathered the papers together with methodical precision. "I'll file these first thing tomorrow. But Pastor?" He waited until Thomas met his gaze, his eyes serious behind his glasses. "This process will test your resolve. The courts need to see that you're truly committed to being there for Emma. Trust, once broken, isn't easily rebuilt." Thomas stood, his legs feeling unsteady beneath him. "Thank you for your help, David." His voice sounded hollow in his own ears. Walking out of the office building, Thomas passed a community bulletin board in the lobby. Among the various flyers and notices, their corners curling with age, his own church bulletin caught his eye. The upcoming Sunday sermon topic was printed in bold letters, "The Power of Redemption." He stared at those words, feeling their weight settle deep in his chest like stones. The irony of it all made him pause in his steps, standing there in the quiet lobby as other people walked past, their footsteps echoing on the marble floor. A janitor's vacuum hummed somewhere in the distance, and through the front windows, he could see the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the sidewalk. The orphanage dining hall buzzed with the clatter of spoons and children's chatter. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, casting warm patches on the worn linoleum floor. The air smelled of instant oatmeal and industrial cleaners, Thomas stood in the doorway, holding a paper bag containing fresh pastries from the local bakery, his heart pounding with nervous anticipation. Emma sat alone at the end of a long table, pushing cereal around in her bowl. Her new stuffed bear sat propped against her orange juice, its fuzzy brown ears slightly damp from condensation. Thomas approached carefully, like someone trying not to startle a wild animal, his footsteps deliberately slow and measured. "Good morning, Emma. May I sit here?" She shrugged without looking up, her shoulders tight and defensive. Thomas settled into the plastic chair beside her, placing the paper bag on the table. The sweet smell of cinnamon rolls wafted out, mixing with the institutional breakfast aromas. From the next table, a group of children watched with undisguised curiosity, their heads huddled together like birds on a wire. A small boy with missing front teeth pointed and whispered loudly to his friend, his voice carrying across the room, "Emma, is that your new dad?" Emma's face darkened, a shadow falling across her features. She gripped her spoon tighter, her knuckles turning white against the metal. "No," she said firmly, each word sharp as ice. "Just a man who feels sorry for me." Thomas felt the words like a physical blow to his chest, stealing his breath. He opened his mouth to protest, but no words came out. The pastries suddenly seemed like a pathetic peace offering, a cheap attempt to buy affection he hadn't earned. Later that evening, during his supervised visit, Thomas sat with Emma in the playroom. She was coloring again, always coloring, as if the world made more sense on paper. This time, it was a picture of a house with dark windows, the crayon strokes heavy and deliberate. "That's nice," Thomas said, trying to bridge the silence between them, his voice gentle. "Do you like to draw?" Finally, Emma looked up at him. Her brown eyes, Sarah's eyes, held years of hurt beyond her age, pools of pain that made his heart ache. "Mommy cried all the time," she said suddenly, her small voice filling the space between them. Thomas's breath caught in his throat. His fingers found the edge of his chair, gripping hard enough to leave marks in his palms. "She said her daddy didn't love her." Emma's voice was matter-of-fact, as if she were simply stating that the sky was blue, but the words cut deeper than any knife could reach. Thomas felt dizzy, the room spinning slightly at the edges. His greatest failure, his deepest shame, laid bare by a 7-year-old's simple words. The weight of it pressed down on his chest until he could barely breathe, years of regret crushing him. Margaret stood watching from the doorway, her arms crossed over her chest, her experienced eyes missing nothing. When Emma went to get more crayons from the plastic bin by the window, she approached Thomas quietly, her shoes barely making a sound on the carpet. "She's testing you," Margaret said, her voice low but firm, wisdom earned from years of watching similar scenes unfold. "If you give up now, she'll never believe you wanted her in the first place." That night, Thomas sat in his study, unable to sleep, the desk lamp casting long shadows on the walls. Sarah's last note lay open on his desk, the paper worn thin at the creases from years of handling, smudged with fingerprints and tears. He picked it up, the familiar words burning his eyes. "I'll raise my baby without you." His fingers crushed the paper slightly as he whispered into the empty room, his voice rough with emotion. "I did love you, Sarah. I just didn't show it." But Emma's words echoed in his mind, a constant reminder of his failure. She didn't believe that. Not yet. The note crumpled further in his trembling hand as the weight of his task ahead became clear. A mountain of mistrust he would have to move one pebble at a time. The evening sun cast long shadows through the orphanage windows, painting the playroom in soft amber light. Thomas entered, carrying his usual briefcase, but tonight felt different. His shoulders were tense with determination to find some way, any way, to reach Emma. The weight of his past mistakes pressed heavily on his mind, making each step feel like a battle against his own doubts. She sat cross-legged on a worn carpet, watching intently as another girl moved chess pieces across a scratched board. Her stuffed bear lay forgotten beside her, its fuzzy ear bent at an awkward angle, but her eyes followed each move with careful attention, her fingers twisted absently in the hem of her oversized sweater. You like chess? Thomas asked, keeping his voice gentle, as if speaking to a spooked animal. Emma's response was her usual shrug, but he noticed how her gaze never left the board. Her shoulders hunched slightly, a defensive posture he'd come to recognize. Thomas pulled up a small plastic chair, the kind meant for children that made his knees nearly touch his chest. The plastic creaked under his weight. Teach me? Emma turned to him then, her forehead creased in disbelief. Her dark eyes studied his face, searching for any sign of mockery. You don't know how to play? No, Thomas admitted, adjusting himself in the tiny chair. But I'd like to learn from someone as smart as you. The words were sincere, carrying his desperate hope to bridge the gulf between them. Something flickered across Emma's face, surprise, maybe even a hint of pride. Her usual mask of indifference cracked just slightly. For the first time since they'd met, she looked at him with something other than hurt or resentment. Fine, she said, moving to set up the pieces. But pay attention, I'm only explaining this once. Her small hands worked with practiced efficiency. Thomas watched as her small fingers arranged the pieces with careful precision. She explained each one's movement with surprising clarity, occasionally correcting his questions with an exasperated sigh that reminded him so much of Sarah, it made his heart ache. The similarity was almost unbearable. They played a short game, Emma's moves quick and confident, while Thomas struggled to remember how each piece worked. The plastic pieces clicked against the board in the quiet room. When she finally cornered his king, a small smirk tugged at her lips. You're bad at this, she declared, but there was a lightness in her voice he hadn't heard before, a tiny crack in her carefully constructed walls. Thomas chuckled, running a hand through his gray hair. I'll get better. The promise held more meaning than just chess. That evening, when bedtime came around, Emma didn't immediately turn away when Thomas offered to read her a story. She listened, clutching her bear, as he read about a lonely penguin finding its family. Her eyes grew heavy, but she fought sleep as if afraid to let her guard down completely. But the next morning, when Thomas arrived with fresh hope in his heart, Emma was back to avoiding his gaze. She sat at breakfast with her back to him, shoulders rigid, her spoon pushing cereal around her bowl without eating. As he prepared to leave, his heart heavy with disappointment, he heard Emma's whispered words to the girl beside her. He'll leave, she said softly, but the words carried across the quiet room like a knife. They always do. Thomas stood frozen in the doorway, his hand gripping the frame until his knuckles turned white. The words hit him like physical blows, each one a reminder of how deeply his own abandonment of Sarah had rippled through time to wound this child. He swallowed hard against the lump in his throat, tasting the bitter truth of Emma's fear. The morning sunlight that had seemed so promising just moments ago now felt harsh and accusing. The morning light filtered through Thomas's office window, casting a warm glow on the stacks of paperwork cluttering his desk. His coffee sat untouched, growing cold as he refreshed his email for the 10th time, each click of the mouse feeling heavier than the last. His heart leaped when he saw the notification from Child Protective Services. Please, Lord, he whispered, clicking to open it, his finger trembling slightly. His initial smile faded as he read the first line. The words blurred, then came into sharp focus. Application status. Rejected. The black letters seemed to burn into his vision. No, he breathed, scrolling frantically through the document. No, no, no. The reason stood out in stark black letters. Neglect history. Failure to maintain parental responsibilities in the past. Each word felt like a physical blow to his chest. Thomas's hands began to shake. The room felt too small, too warm, the walls seeming to close in around him. He grabbed his phone, fumbling with the numbers as he dialed David Carter's office, nearly dropping it twice. I got the rejection, Thomas said, his voice rough with emotion. There has to be something we can do. David sighed heavily on the other end. Thomas, we discussed this. The system doesn't forget. Your history with Sarah, it's a red flag for them. They look at these things very carefully. But I've changed, Thomas insisted, gripping the phone tighter until his knuckles went white. I'm not that man anymore. That was 20 years ago. I know, David said, his tone frustrated but not surprised. "We need to fight this. File an appeal, gather character witnesses. It won't be easy, but—" Thomas barely heard the rest. He grabbed his keys and headed for his car, the world spinning around him like a carnival ride he couldn't stop. The drive to the orphanage passed in a blur of traffic lights and street signs. Margaret was in the front office when he arrived, sorting through files at her desk. One look at his face told her everything she needed to know. "They rejected it," Thomas said, his voice barely above a whisper, the words catching in his throat. "They won't let me adopt her." Margaret's eyes softened with understanding. She glanced toward the playroom where Emma sat drawing, oblivious to the conversation that would affect her future, her small world still peaceful and unchanged. "They think you'll fail her like you failed Sarah," Margaret said quietly, her words gentle but honest, each one hitting home. Thomas watched Emma through the doorway. She was using blue crayon to draw what looked like a sky, her small face scrunched in concentration, tongue sticking out slightly at the corner of her mouth. The stuffed bear he'd given her sat propped against her leg, its button eyes seeming to stare back at him accusingly. "I have to fix this," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I have to prove them wrong. She needs me." He walked outside, the morning air cool against his face, carrying the scent of freshly cut grass. The sky stretched endlessly above him, clear and blue, the same color as Emma's crayon, the same shade as Sarah's eyes had been. "God," he whispered, looking up. "If you're listening, I can't lose her too." His voice cracked like thin ice. "Please, I know I don't deserve another chance, but she deserves a family. Help me make this right." For the first time in years, Thomas prayed not out of duty or habit, but with raw, desperate need. His hands clasped together so tightly his knuckles turned white, and tears he couldn't hold back anymore rolled down his cheeks, falling unnoticed onto his shirt. The weight of his past mistakes pressed down on him like a physical burden, but for Emma's sake, he knew he had to find the strength to carry it. The living room was silent except for the soft ticking of the grandfather clock. Thomas sat in his old armchair, his Bible open on one knee, and Sarah's crumpled letter on the other. The table lamp cast a weak circle of light around him, leaving the rest of the room in shadows. The worn leather of the chair creaked as he shifted, a sound as familiar as his own heartbeat. His fingers traced Sarah's handwriting for what felt like the 100th time. "If you ever change your mind, I hope you'll find us." The words blurred as tears filled his eyes. He had changed his mind, but far too late. The paper was thin from countless readings, the ink slightly faded where his thumb always rested. The memory hit him like a physical blow. Sarah, 16 and terrified, standing in this very room with her small suitcase. Her voice trembled as she spoke the words that would haunt him forever. She'd worn her favorite blue sweater that day, the one her mother had given her for Christmas. "I needed you, Daddy." He'd turned away then, his pride and anger winning out over love. The door had closed behind her with a quiet click, not a slam. Somehow that made it worse. That gentle sound had echoed in his dreams for years. Thomas buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking. "I'm so sorry, baby girl," he whispered into the empty room. The words felt hollow, inadequate against the weight of his regret. For a moment, doubt crept in. Maybe the system was right. Maybe Emma would be better off without him. He'd failed as a father. What made him think he could succeed as a grandfather? The thought settled in his stomach like lead, cold and heavy. But then he remembered Emma's voice, small but certain. "You're supposed to take me home." Those words cut through his self-pity like a knife through butter. She'd known somehow, despite everything she'd known. Her eyes had held the same determination he'd once seen in Sarah's. Thomas sat up straighter, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. He reached for his phone, checking the time, 12:47 a.m. Too late to call, but he couldn't wait. His hands trembled slightly as he pressed the buttons. He dialed David Carter's number, praying the lawyer would answer. After 4 rings, a groggy voice came through. The sound of rustling sheets carried over the line. "Thomas?" What's wrong? I don't care what it takes, Thomas said, his voice stronger than it had been all day. We fight this. There was a long pause, then a heavy sigh. Then we'll start with an appeal, but be ready for a battle. Thomas's fingers tightened around Sarah's letter, feeling the worn creases in the paper. I'm ready. The words came out firm, unwavering. The clock struck 1, its chime echoing through the quiet house. Thomas looked down at the Bible in his lap, at the letter that represented all his past mistakes. He was done running from them, done hiding behind his collar and his sermons. It was time to fight, not just for Emma, but for the second chance he never gave Sarah. The moonlight filtering through the window caught the silver in his hair, a reminder of all the years he'd wasted, and all the ones he still had left to make things right. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in the stark courthouse filing office. Thomas shifted uncomfortably in the hard plastic chair, his suit jacket feeling too tight across his shoulders. The clock on the wall read 9 a.m., but he'd been here since 8, watching clerks shuffle papers and listening to the monotonous hum of copy machines. His coffee, long since cold, sat untouched on the corner of the table. David Carter sat beside him, spreading documents across the small table. His tie was perfectly straight, his manner professional but kind. The key here is documentation, he explained, pointing to various papers with his well-manicured finger. We need character witnesses, proof of income, evidence of a stable home environment. But most importantly, we need to show the court you're not the same man who turned his back on Sarah. They'll want to see concrete changes. Thomas's throat tightened at the mention of his daughter's name. The weight of his past pressed down on his chest like a physical thing. Before he could respond, familiar footsteps echoed through the quiet office. Margaret Lewis strode toward them, her practical shoes clicking against the tile floor. Her sudden appearance made both men look up in surprise. I hope you don't mind me joining, Margaret said, pulling up a chair with quiet authority. Her gray hair was pulled back in its usual neat bun, her expression determined. A folder tucked under her arm held what looked like years of experience. I've worked in the system for 23 years. I know exactly what these judges look for. Thomas blinked, confused by her presence. His voice came out rougher than intended. Why are you helping me? Margaret's stern face softened slightly. She folded her hands on the table and looked him directly in the eyes, her gaze unwavering. Because I've watched you with Emma this past week. I see how much you love her. And more importantly, I see how much you regret your past mistakes. That matters to me. They spent the next 2 hours preparing the appeal, the pile of papers growing steadily larger. Margaret's expertise proved invaluable as she guided them through the complex process, pointing out potential pitfalls and suggesting stronger approaches. Her suggestions strengthened their case considerably, turning uncertainty into something that felt like hope. Later that afternoon, Thomas visited Emma at the orphanage. She sat cross-legged on the floor of the playroom, carefully arranging chess pieces on the board, each one placed with deliberate precision. When she looked up at him, her brown eyes, Sarah's eyes, narrowed with concern, showing wisdom beyond her years. Why do you look sad? She asked, her small hand pausing over a knight, hovering uncertainly. Thomas tried to smile, settling down on the floor beside her with a slight groan. Just a long day, sweetheart. Nothing for you to worry about. Emma studied him with that unnervingly perceptive gaze of hers, her fingers absently stroking the knight's mane. She didn't believe him, he could tell, but she didn't press further. Instead, she moved her knight across the board with quiet determination. Your turn, she said quietly. As Thomas considered his move, watching the pieces blur slightly before his eyes, his heart ached with a silent promise to this little girl who'd lost so much. He wouldn't give up, no matter what it took. The weight of that promise settled into his bones. The drive home felt longer than usual, each mile stretching endlessly before him. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of orange and pink, but Thomas barely noticed, lost in thoughts of court dates and second chances. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as he whispered a prayer into the gathering dusk. God, I don't deserve another chance, but if you give me one. His voice cracked slightly, thick with emotion. I won't waste it. I promise you that. The morning sun filtered through the orphanage windows, casting long shadows across the dormitory floor. Emma sat on her bed, her small hands folded in her lap, watching as Margaret carefully folded her few belongings into a worn backpack. The scuffed zipper caught on the fabric as Margaret worked, making Emma flinch at each harsh sound. The other beds in the room stood empty. All the children were at breakfast, but Emma couldn't eat. Her stomach felt like it was full of butterflies, each flutter a reminder of the changes ahead. Thomas stood in the doorway, his heart aching at how little she owned. A few worn books with dog-eared pages, some hand-me-down clothes that had seen better days, and the stuffed bear he'd given her last month, its fur already matted from constant holding. The social worker had explained this was temporary, a probationary period to see if they could be a family. The words temporary and probationary made his chest tight, reminding him too much of his own failures. Emma, sweetheart? He knelt beside her bed, trying to catch her eye, the floor hard against his knees. Are you ready to go? She shrugged, her small shoulders barely moving under her oversized sweater, the sleeves hanging past her fingertips. Don't have a choice. Her voice was flat, resigned, and it cut through him like a knife. The words carried the weight of too many moves, too many goodbyes. The drive home was quiet, punctuated only by the soft hum of the car engine and occasional traffic sounds. Emma stared out the window, clutching her backpack to her chest like a shield, her breath leaving small, foggy patches on the glass. Thomas kept glancing at her in the rearview mirror, wanting to say something, anything, to break the silence, but the words wouldn't come. Each mile marker they passed felt like another reminder of the distance between them. His house looked different now through Emma's eyes. The grand entrance that had once felt impressive now seemed cold and imposing, with its high ceilings and echoing spaces. The silence that he'd grown used to felt suffocating. Emma's footsteps echoed on the hardwood floors as she followed him inside, each step hesitant and measured. Your room is upstairs, Thomas said softly, leading the way. He'd spent the weekend preparing it. Fresh paint in sunny yellow, new curtains with tiny butterflies, books lined up on shelves, and stuffed animals arranged on the bed. He'd wanted it to feel warm, welcoming, like the room he wished he'd given Sarah all those years ago. Emma walked in slowly, taking everything in, her eyes moving from corner to corner as if memorizing escape routes. She sat on the edge of the bed but made no move to unpack her bag. Instead, she placed it carefully by the door within easy reach. Just in case, she muttered, not meeting his eyes, her fingers lingering on the zipper. The day passed in awkward moments and careful movements, like two people dancing around each other, afraid to step too close. When evening came, Thomas made spaghetti, one of the few meals he knew how to cook well, the sauce recipe learned from his late wife. They sat across from each other at the large dining room table, the scraping of forks against plates, the only sound breaking the heavy silence. Emma pushed her meatballs around her plate, creating little trails in the sauce, then looked up suddenly, her brown eyes, so like Sarah's, fixed on him with an unsettling directness that made his breath catch. You don't know how to do this, do you? Thomas felt a surprised laugh bubble up in his chest. It was such an honest question, asked with such simple clarity, cutting through all their careful pretense. No, sweetheart, he admitted, setting down his fork. I don't. But I'm trying. She studied him for a long moment, her fork suspended midair, sauce dripping slowly back to her plate. She didn't smile, but something in her expression shifted, softened just slightly, like ice beginning to thaw. For the first time since he'd met her, she looked at him like she believed him. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was a start, a tiny crack in the wall between them. The morning sun crept through the kitchen windows as Thomas stood at the stove, carefully flipping pancakes. He'd woken up extra early, determined to make Emma's first real breakfast in her new home special. The smell of coffee and eggs filled the air, mingling with the sweet scent of vanilla he'd added to the batter, and he'd even managed to arrange the pancakes in a smiley face, hoping it might coax a smile from his granddaughter. His hands trembled slightly as he added the final touches. Emma trudged into the kitchen, her hair uncombed and her pajamas wrinkled, clutching the worn teddy bear she pretended not to need. She slid into her chair without a word, arms crossed tightly over her chest, her feet swinging restlessly beneath the table. Thomas placed the plate in front of her, his heart beating faster with anticipation. "I made your pancakes extra fluffy," he said, trying to sound cheerful despite the knot in his stomach. "And there's syrup if you'd like some. I got the maple kind, real maple syrup." Emma stared at the plate, then pushed it away with one finger, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Not hungry." "Emma, you have to eat something. It's going to be a long day." Thomas fought to keep his voice gentle, remembering what the social worker had said about patience. She lifted her chin, her eyes hard and defensive, flashing with a hurt that broke his heart. "You're not my dad." The words hung in the air between them like shards of glass. Thomas gripped the edge of the counter, steadying himself against the sudden wave of pain. He'd known this wouldn't be easy, but each rejection still felt like a physical blow, reminding him of all his past failures. Throughout the day, Emma continued her silent rebellion. When Thomas called her name, she acted as if she couldn't hear him, though he caught her watching him when she thought he wasn't looking. Her toys lay scattered across the living room floor, a chaotic mess of plastic and stuffed animals, and when he asked her to clean up, she simply walked away, her footsteps deliberate and defiant. "Emma," he said, following her down the hallway. "We need to talk about this." She kept walking, her small shoulders rigid with tension, her ponytail swinging with each determined step. Thomas watched her disappear up the stairs, his heart heavy with memories. He remembered Sarah at that age, stubborn, fierce, determined. But Sarah had trusted him then, had run to him with skinned knees and childhood troubles. Emma didn't trust anyone, and he knew exactly why. By bedtime, Thomas felt completely drained, every muscle aching with emotional exhaustion. He stood in Emma's doorway, watching as she climbed into bed without a word, her movements sharp and angry. "Good night, Emma," he said softly, clinging to hope. She rolled over, presenting her back to him, pulling the covers up to her ears. No response. Back in his own room, Thomas sat heavily on his bed, the springs creaking under his weight. The day's weight pressed down on his shoulders like a physical burden. He reached for the photograph of Sarah he kept on his nightstand, her young face smiling up at him, unaware of the pain that lay ahead. The glass was slightly smudged where his fingers had traced her features countless times. "How do I fix this, baby girl?" he whispered to the photograph, his voice rough with unshed tears. The silence that answered him felt heavier than ever, filled with all the words he wished he'd said years ago. The exhaustion of the day settled deep in his bones, making his joints ache with more than just age, but Sarah's face continued to stare back at him, offering no answers to the challenge that lay before him. In the quiet of his room, he could hear Emma's muffled sniffles through the wall, and his hands clenched with the effort of not rushing to comfort her. Thomas stood at the school playground, watching children stream out of their classrooms. The autumn breeze rustled through nearby trees, carrying the sounds of laughter and excited chatter. His hands felt clammy as he waited, scanning the crowd for Emma's familiar face. A group of parents gathered nearby, sharing cheerful conversations about weekend plans and after-school activities. But Thomas kept his distance, focused solely on finding his granddaughter. When she finally emerged, she was last in line, her small shoulders hunched as she dragged her backpack across the ground. The sight made his heart ache. The bright purple backpack he'd bought her just weeks ago was now coated in dust from being dragged. He raised his hand in a gentle wave, trying to catch her eye. "Hey, sweetheart, how was school?" Emma walked right past him, her eyes fixed on the ground. She didn't even pause to acknowledge his presence, her shoelaces trailing untied behind her. Before he could follow, Mrs. Carter, a kind-faced woman with graying hair and wire-rimmed glasses, touched his arm. "Pastor Brooks? Could I have a moment?" He nodded, keeping one eye on Emma, who had stopped near the school fence, her back turned to them. She was picking at the peeling paint on the metal bars, a nervous habit he'd noticed lately. "Emma had a difficult day," Mrs. Carter said softly, her forehead creased with concern. She clutched her teaching folder closer to her chest. During reading time, she had quite an upset. "What happened?" Mrs. Carter's eyes filled with sympathy. One of the students was talking about their mother. It triggered something in Emma. She started crying and couldn't stop. When we tried to comfort her, she just kept saying she didn't have a mom anymore. We had to take her to the counselor's office to calm down. Thomas's throat tightened. He glanced at Emma, still standing alone by the fence. The late afternoon sun cast her small shadow long across the playground. I don't know what to say to her." "Just be there," Mrs. Carter advised, squeezing his arm gently. "Sometimes that's all we can do." The drive home was silent. Emma stared out the window, clutching her backpack like a shield. Her reflection in the glass showed red-rimmed eyes and tear-stained cheeks. When they got home, she disappeared into her room until dinner time, the soft click of her door lock echoing through the quiet house. At the dinner table, Emma pushed her food around her plate, not taking a single bite. Thomas sat beside her, watching helplessly as she stabbed at a piece of chicken with her fork. The vegetables he'd carefully prepared, carrots cut into little stars the way she usually liked them, remained untouched. "Do you want to talk about today?" he asked gently. "No." Her voice was barely above a whisper, cracking slightly on the single word. The ticking of the kitchen clock filled the heavy silence between them. Thomas searched for the right words, but everything felt inadequate. The steam from their untouched dinner slowly dissipated into the air. Finally, Emma's small voice broke the quiet. "I miss my mommy." The words hit Thomas like a physical blow. He wanted to reach out, to hold her, to somehow make it better. But he remained frozen, trapped by his own guilt and uncertainty. His hand hovered halfway across the table before falling back to his side. That night he checked on her before going to bed. Emma lay curled up in her blankets, fast asleep. In her arms, she clutched the stuffed bear he'd given her at the orphanage, the first gift he'd ever given her. The bear's fur was matted from countless tears and tight hugs, but she never went to sleep without it. It wasn't much, but seeing her hold on to it gave him a tiny spark of hope. He stood in the doorway, watching her steady breathing, noticing how young and vulnerable she looked in sleep. The moonlight streaming through her window cast soft shadows across her face, highlighting the dried tear tracks on her cheeks and reminding him so much of Sarah at that age that it made his chest hurt. A photo of Sarah as a teenager sat on Emma's nightstand, face down as always, another reminder of his failures that haunted them both. The steady rhythm of rain against the windows filled Thomas's dark bedroom. He lay awake, listening to the gentle tapping, his mind wandering through memories of Sarah. The house felt especially quiet at 2 a.m., with only the soft hum of the heating system and the occasional rumble of distant thunder. A piercing scream shattered the silence. Thomas bolted upright, his heart hammering against his ribs. Another scream echoed through the hallway, Emma's voice filled with terror. He threw off his covers and ran, his bare feet pounding against the wooden floor. He burst into Emma's room to find her sitting up in bed, her small body shaking. Sweat matted her hair to her forehead, and tears streamed down her face. Her hands clutched her blanket so tightly her knuckles were white. "Mommy," she sobbed, her eyes wide but unseeing. "Mommy!" Without hesitation, Thomas sat on the edge of her bed and gathered her into his arms. She felt so small, so fragile against his chest. "It's okay," he whispered, holding her close. "You're safe. I'm here." To his surprise, Emma didn't push him away or stiffen at his touch. Instead, she grabbed fistfuls of his shirt, burying her face against him as deep sobs racked her body. Thomas felt each cry like a knife in his heart. "Shh," he soothed, gently rubbing circles on her back. "You're okay. I'm here. I'm right here." Gradually, her sobs quieted to hiccups and sniffles. The rain continued its gentle pattern outside, creating a soft backdrop to their shared moment. "I had a bad dream," Emma whispered, her voice hoarse from crying. Thomas kept his hand moving in gentle circles on her back. "I know, sweetheart." She pulled back slightly, wiping her nose with the back of her hand. Her eyes, still wet with tears, met his in the dim light. She seemed to be studying his face, perhaps looking for something she wasn't sure she'd find. "Can you?" She hesitated, her lower lip trembling. "Can you stay until I fall asleep?" Thomas felt his throat tighten with emotion. "Of course," he managed to say. He helped her lie back down, tucking the blankets around her. Then he settled beside her, his back against the headboard. Emma curled up next to him, one small hand still holding onto his shirt, as if afraid he might disappear. The rain continued its gentle lullaby as Emma's breathing gradually slowed and deepened. Just when Thomas thought she had drifted off, her voice came again, soft and drowsy. "Good night, Grandpa." Thomas felt tears well up in his eyes. 3 simple words, but they meant everything. He blinked rapidly, trying to clear his vision as he watched his granddaughter finally surrender to sleep. Sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows, casting warm golden patterns across the wooden floor. Thomas stood at the stove, flipping pancakes with mechanical precision. His movements were careful, measured, just like every morning for the past week. The familiar scent of coffee and maple syrup filled the air, but today felt different somehow. Last night's breakthrough lingered in his mind, Emma's tearful vulnerability, and that whispered, "Good night, Grandpa," still echoing in his heart. He heard soft footsteps padding down the hallway. Emma appeared in the doorway, her hair slightly messy from sleep, still wearing her blue pajamas with little stars on them. Thomas held his breath, waiting for the usual morning resistance. But Emma simply climbed onto her chair at the table, rubbing her eyes sleepily. No crossed arms, no glares, no turned back. She just sat there, watching him cook with tired eyes. Thomas placed a plate of pancakes in front of her, trying to keep his movements casual despite the way his heart was racing. He'd learned not to expect too much, not to push too hard. Every morning had been a battle just to get her to look at the food. Emma picked up her fork. Thomas nearly dropped his coffee mug when she took her first bite. "You're eating," he said, unable to hide his surprise. She shrugged, her mouth full of pancake. "I like pancakes," she said simply, as if it was the most normal thing in the world. Thomas felt a small smile tugging at his lips but fought to keep his face neutral. He didn't want to make a big deal of it, didn't want to spook her back into her shell. He lifted his coffee mug to his lips, grateful for something to do with his hands. Then Emma looked up, her brown eyes, Sarah's eyes, meeting his. "Good morning, Grandpa." Coffee went down the wrong way and Thomas coughed, nearly spilling the rest of his mug. His hands trembled as he set it down on the counter. The simple words hit him like a tidal wave, and he had to cover his face for a moment, overwhelmed by emotion. When he finally looked at Emma again, she was watching him closely. There was the tiniest hint of a smile playing at the corners of her mouth, an expression he'd never seen on her face before. In that moment, Thomas felt something shift inside him, like a key turning in a lock that had been rusted shut for years. Maybe, just maybe, he was finally earning his second chance. Thomas sat at his desk, surrounded by stacks of legal documents that would determine his and Emma's future. The morning light cast long shadows across the papers, custody forms, character references, and financial statements. His coffee had gone cold, forgotten amid the rush to organize everything for Monday's hearing. David Carter arrived promptly at 9, his leather briefcase worn but professional. The lawyer's expression was serious as he spread additional documents across the desk. "The good news is we have solid evidence of your commitment," David said, tapping a thick folder. 6 months of consistent visits before the temporary custody, plus these last few weeks of stable care. Margaret's arrival brought a motherly warmth to the room. She carried her own stack of papers, detailed notes about Thomas's interactions with Emma at the orphanage. "The judge needs to see the whole picture," she explained, settling into a chair. "Not just who you were, but who you've become." The caseworker's latest report is still concerning, David warned, sliding a document forward. She emphasizes your history with Sarah, says patterns of neglect tend to repeat. Thomas's hands trembled slightly as he picked up the report. But I've changed. Emma knows that now. We know you have, Margaret assured him. That's why I'm testifying. The way you handled Emma's nightmares, her testing behaviors, you've proven yourself. David nodded, but his expression remained cautious. Still, be prepared. The caseworker will be tough. She'll bring up Sarah, try to show you haven't really changed. The sound of small feet padding down the hallway made them all look up. Emma appeared in the doorway, her hair messy from sleep, still wearing her favorite pajamas with cartoon bears. Her eyes took in the scene, the adults, the papers, the serious faces. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice small and uncertain. Thomas pushed back from his desk, creating space between himself and the intimidating pile of documents. "Just getting ready for something important, sweetheart." Emma's fingers twisted in the hem of her pajama top. Her next question made Thomas's heart squeeze painfully in his chest. "Do I have to go back?" The fear in her voice was unmistakable. Thomas wanted nothing more than to promise her everything would be fine, but he couldn't lie. "Not if I can help it," he said softly. Emma nodded, but her shoulders remained tense. She lingered for a moment longer, then turned and walked back toward her room, her steps slightly heavier than before. Thomas watched her go, his chest tight with emotion. When she was out of earshot, he clasped his hands together, pressing them against his forehead. His whispered prayer was barely audible. "God, don't let me fail her." Margaret and David exchanged glances, understanding the weight of what was at stake. The papers on the desk weren't just documents anymore. They were the bridge between a lonely past and the possibility of a real family. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the windows of Thomas's home, painting golden stripes across the living room floor. Emma sat cross-legged behind the couch, coloring in her favorite book, when Thomas's phone rang. She didn't mean to eavesdrop, but his heavy sigh made her pause, crayon hovering over the page. "David, I understand the risks," Thomas said, his voice tired and strained. "But what if the judge rules against me?" Emma's hand tightened around her crayon. She held her breath, trying to catch every word. I know, Thomas continued, pacing near the kitchen. "But if the judge rules against me, there won't be anything else I can do." The crayon snapped in Emma's grip. Her heart pounded so loud she almost missed David's muffled response through the phone. "We just have to hope for the best," David said. Emma's vision blurred with tears. She understood what grown-ups meant when they talked like that. They were giving up, just like everyone else had given up on her. "He's giving up," she whispered to herself, her small hands trembling. The broken crayon fell to the carpet, forgotten. That night, after Thomas said goodnight, Emma waited until the house grew quiet. Her chest felt tight as she pulled her backpack from under her bed. She stuffed it with her favorite sweater, the stuffed bear Thomas had given her, and a photo of her mom. Tears dripped onto her pillowcase as she wrote the note with shaky letters. "I get it. You don't want me either." She placed it carefully on her pillow, next to the chess piece she'd won from Thomas during their first game. The house creaked as Emma tiptoed down the stairs. Each sound made her freeze, terrified Thomas would catch her, but he didn't. The front door seemed huge and heavy as she carefully turned the handle. Cool night air hit her face. Stars twinkled above, but they offered no comfort. Emma took one last look at the house that had almost become home. Her throat hurt from holding back sobs. Later that night, Thomas walked up the stairs to check on Emma before heading to bed himself. The hallway seemed longer than usual, shadows deeper. "Emma?" he called softly, pushing her door open. The room was empty. His heart skipped a beat. "Emma?" His voice grew louder, more desperate. The silence that answered him was deafening. He rushed to her bed, spotting the note immediately. As he read the words, his hands began to shake. The chess piece rolled off the pillow, hitting the floor with a small final tap. "Emma!" His shout echoed through the empty house, but only silence answered. Thunder rumbled overhead as Thomas burst out of his house into the rain-slicked darkness. His heart hammered against his ribs while he fumbled with his phone, dialing Margaret's number with trembling fingers. "She's gone," he choked out when Margaret answered. "Emma's run away." "I'll check the orphanage," Margaret said immediately. "Call the police, Thomas." Now. The rain fell harder as Thomas ran to his car, calling the police with shaking hands. "My granddaughter," he explained, voice cracking. "She's 7. Please, you have to help find her." He drove through the darkened streets, windshield wipers beating frantically against the downpour. Every shadow made him flinch, every small movement caught his eye. The orphanage was empty. Margaret confirmed it with worried eyes. "Where else?" Thomas whispered, gripping his steering wheel. Where would she go? Lightning flashed, illuminating the streets in harsh white light. Thomas's mind raced back to another rainy night, years ago. Sarah, standing in the rain, begging him to listen. He'd closed the door on her then, left her alone in the storm. "Not again," he prayed. "Please, God, not again." He drove past parks, past Emma's school, past every place he could think of. The storm grew worse, wind whipping tree branches into angry dances. Then, as he passed his church for the 3rd time, a flash of lightning revealed something. A small figure huddled against the church wall. Thomas slammed on his brakes, tires squealing on wet pavement. He jumped out, rain immediately soaking through his clothes. There she was, Emma, curled into a tight ball, shivering violently. "Emma!" he called out, running to her. She looked up, her face pale and wet with rain and tears. Thomas fell to his knees beside her, not caring about the cold concrete beneath him. "Sweetheart, why? Why did you run?" His voice broke as he reached for her. Emma's lips trembled, her words barely audible above the storm. "You were gonna send me away." She hugged herself tighter. "I heard you on the phone. You said there was nothing else you could do." Understanding crashed over Thomas like a wave. "No, baby girl, no." He gently touched her cold cheek. "I was talking about the judge. If they try to take you away from me, I would never give up on you. Never." Emma's eyes widened, hope and doubt warring in her expression. "Really?" "Really," Thomas said firmly. "You're my granddaughter. You're all I have left of your mom. But more than that, you're Emma. And I love you." Emma's face crumpled and she launched herself into his arms, sobbing. Thomas held her tight, his own tears mixing with the rain as he lifted her up. She clung to his neck, crying softly into his shoulder as he carried her toward the car. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I was scared." "I know, sweetheart," Thomas murmured, holding her closer. "I know. But you don't have to be scared anymore. I've got you." The courthouse loomed before them, its gray stone walls stretching up into the cloudy morning sky. Thomas held Emma's small hand as they climbed the wide steps, his heart pounding against his ribs. Inside, the polished floors echoed with their footsteps as they made their way to the courtroom. Margaret and David were already waiting, their faces tense but hopeful. The CPS caseworker sat on the opposite side, her expression stern and unyielding. Emma squeezed Thomas's hand tighter. "It's going to be okay, sweetheart," Thomas whispered, though his own voice trembled. The judge entered and everyone rose. Thomas couldn't help but notice how the morning light filtering through the high windows cast long shadows across the wooden bench where their fate would be decided. David presented their case first, his voice steady and confident as he detailed Thomas's progress. He showed documentation of Emma's improved school performance, the stable home environment, and Thomas's unwavering commitment. Margaret took the stand next, her eyes kind but fierce as she spoke. "I've worked with countless families over the years," she testified. "Thomas has done everything right. But more than that, he loves Emma. I've watched him become the father, the grandfather she needs." The caseworker's testimony cut deep. "Your Honor," she said, her voice cold with professional detachment, "a man who failed his daughter once may fail again. The system cannot risk another child's well-being on mere promises of change. Thomas felt Emma's hand tighten in his. He looked down to see her lower lip trembling. When it was his turn to speak, Thomas stood slowly. His legs felt weak, but his resolve was strong. He faced the judge, aware of Emma's eyes on him, of everyone watching. "Your Honor," he began, his voice shaking with emotion, "I failed Sarah. I live with that every day of my life." He paused, swallowing hard. "But I refuse to fail Emma. When my daughter needed me most, I let pride and judgment cloud my heart. I lost my chance to make it right with Sarah, but God has given me another chance with Emma." Thomas glanced at his granddaughter, seeing Sarah's eyes looking back at him. Love isn't just about saying the right words. It's about showing up every day, even when it's hard. It's about learning from our mistakes and choosing to be better. Emma has taught me more about love in these past months than I learned in all my years of preaching about it. Tears welled in Emma's eyes as she watched him speak. The courtroom fell silent, heavy with the weight of his words. The judge studied Thomas for what felt like an eternity, her expression unreadable. Finally, she cleared her throat. "Mr. Brooks," she began, "you have proven your love. The adoption is granted." Emma gasped. Before anyone could stop her, she bolted from her seat and ran straight into Thomas's arms, tears streaming down her face. Thomas held her close, his own tears falling freely as he lifted her up. The judge entered, his black robe swishing as he took his seat behind the imposing wooden bench. The courtroom fell silent, the only sound the gentle hum of the air conditioning and the shuffling of papers as the judge reviewed Thomas's case file. Emma's small hand trembled in Thomas's as they waited. The CPS caseworker sat straight-backed and professional, her expression unchanging as she watched the proceedings. Margaret and David exchanged worried glances from their seats behind Thomas. "Mr. Brooks," the judge began, his voice echoing in the quiet room, "you have presented a compelling case for adoption." He paused, looking over his reading glasses at Thomas. "Your commitment to Emma these past months has been noteworthy." The caseworker stood, her voice firm. "Your Honor, while Mr. Brooks has shown improvement, the state cannot ignore that he has a history of neglect. His abandonment of his daughter Sarah raises serious concerns about his ability to provide long-term stability." Thomas felt Emma's grip tighten on his hand. He rose slowly to his feet, his heart pounding but his voice steady. "Your Honor, I failed my daughter once. That's true. I have to live with that every day." He swallowed hard. "But Emma, she's my second chance, and I won't waste it. I can't change the past, but I can be better for her future." To everyone's surprise, Emma suddenly spoke up, her small voice clear and determined. "I don't want another family. I want him." The judge leaned forward, studying the little girl who now stood beside her grandfather. "He came back for me. Nobody else did that." The courtroom fell silent. The judge took a deep breath, looking between Thomas and Emma. After what felt like an eternity, he spoke. "Mr. Brooks, you have proven your commitment to Emma's well-being. The court grants your petition for adoption." Emma gasped. Thomas stood frozen for a moment, barely breathing, until Emma tugged on his sleeve. "Grandpa?" she whispered. Thomas dropped to his knees and pulled Emma into his arms. She buried her face in his shoulder, her small body shaking with sobs. "You mean I can stay?" she asked, her voice muffled against his jacket. Thomas held her tighter, tears streaming down his own face. "Forever, sweetheart." Margaret wiped her eyes in the background while David gathered the paperwork with a satisfied smile. Even the caseworker's stern expression had softened slightly at the sight of their embrace. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows of Thomas's home, casting a warm glow across the adoption certificate that lay on the kitchen table. Emma stood in her doorway, staring at her room as if seeing it for the first time. Her small backpack, the one she'd kept packed just in case, hung loosely from her fingers. Thomas leaned against the doorframe, watching as Emma took tentative steps into the space. She reached into her bag and pulled out a silver picture frame, handling it with the kind of care usually reserved for precious treasures. In it, Sarah smiled brightly, her dark hair falling in waves around her face. Emma's fingers traced the edge of the frame before placing it carefully on her nightstand. Thomas felt his throat tighten at the sight of his daughter's photograph, but he remained quiet, giving Emma this moment. She turned slowly, taking in the pale yellow walls, the flowered bedspread, and the white curtains dancing in the breeze from the open window. "So this is really mine?" Emma's voice was barely above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might make it all disappear. "It's all yours, baby girl," Thomas assured her, his voice gentle. "Every bit of it." He cleared his throat and smiled. "Actually, I have something else for you." He stepped aside, revealing a wooden bookshelf he'd positioned just outside her door. Emma's eyes widened as he wheeled it in. The shelves were filled with books of all sizes and colors, adventure stories, fairy tales, and even some chess strategy books he'd picked up after noticing her interest in the game. For the first time since she'd arrived, a genuine smile spread across Emma's face. Her eyes lit up as she ran her fingers along the spines of the books. "These are all for me?" "Every single one." Thomas nodded, his heart swelling at her reaction. The phone rang and Thomas answered to hear Margaret's warm voice. "Congratulations, Thomas. I knew you could do it." Thomas walked to the hallway, watching Emma as she pulled out a book and settled on her bed to read. "I never thought we'd get here," he admitted quietly. "I doubted myself so many times." "But you didn't give up," Margaret reminded him. "That's what matters." After saying goodbye, Thomas spent the rest of the afternoon watching Emma explore her new space. She arranged her few belongings carefully, no longer keeping them packed away. Each item found its perfect spot: her stuffed bear on the bed, her drawing supplies on the desk, her clothes hanging in the closet instead of stuffed in her backpack. When evening came, Thomas helped Emma get ready for bed. She climbed under the covers, clutching her bear close. Thomas tucked the blanket around her shoulders and switched on the small nightlight they'd picked out together. "Good night, sweetheart," he said softly, turning to leave. "Good night, Grandpa," Emma replied, and this time her voice was clear and certain. No hesitation, no fear. Just the simple trust of a child who finally felt at home. Thomas paused in the doorway, his heart full as he watched Emma snuggle deeper into her covers, Sarah's photo watching over her from the nightstand. For the first time, the house felt complete. Not just a building, but a home filled with love and second chances. Sunlight filtered through the stained glass windows, painting rainbow patterns across the church pews. The congregation sat attentively as Thomas stood at the pulpit, his voice steady and warm. Unlike his sermons from before, there was no hint of emptiness in his words now. Every syllable rang with genuine conviction. "God's grace isn't just about forgiveness," Thomas said, his eyes scanning the familiar faces before him. "It's about second chances, about starting over." His gaze landed briefly on Emma, who sat in the front row, her small legs swinging beneath the pew. As the final hymn ended and people began to file out, Emma stayed behind. She fidgeted with the hem of her Sunday dress, gathering her courage. Thomas was speaking with a few church members when he felt a gentle tug on his sleeve. "Grandpa?" Emma's voice was quiet but determined. Thomas excused himself and turned to face her. "What is it, sweetheart?" Emma twisted her hands together, looking down at her shiny black shoes before meeting his eyes. "I want to be baptized." The words hit Thomas like a wave, making his breath catch. He knelt down to her level, his knees creaking against the hardwood floor. "Are you sure, sweetheart?" Emma nodded, her eyes bright with purpose. "Mommy told me that baptism is like starting over. I want to start over too." Thomas felt tears welling up in his eyes. Around them, the remaining congregation members watched with gentle smiles, touched by the scene unfolding before them. Mrs. Johnson, who'd been a member for 30 years, dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. Thomas placed his hands on Emma's shoulders, his voice thick with emotion. "Then we'll do it next Sunday. Just you and me." Emma threw her arms around his neck, hugging him tightly. The force of her embrace nearly knocked him off balance, but he didn't care. He held her close, feeling her small heart beating against his chest. When she finally pulled back, Emma wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Mommy would be happy, right?" Thomas pulled her into another hug, his own tears falling freely now. "She'd be so proud of you." The church was filled with a sacred hush as sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, casting kaleidoscope patterns across the baptismal pool. The water sparkled, reflecting tiny rainbows onto the wooden ceiling above. Thomas stood in the pool, his black pastor's robe floating slightly in the water around him, watching as Emma took careful steps down into the pool. Emma wore a simple white dress that billowed around her in the water. Her dark hair was pulled back neatly, and her eyes were wide with anticipation. The congregation sat in reverent silence, many dabbing at their eyes, knowing the significance of this moment for both grandfather and granddaughter. Margaret, sitting in the front row, smiled encouragingly at Emma. Several children from the orphanage had come to witness the baptism, their faces pressed against the wooden railings of the front pews. The water reached Emma's knees as she stood beside Thomas. She looked small next to him, but there was determination in her stance. Thomas turned to face her, his eyes filled with emotion. "You ready, sweetheart?" he asked softly, his voice carrying across the hushed sanctuary. Emma took a deep breath, her shoulders rising and falling. She nodded, her chin lifted with quiet certainty. Thomas gently took her small hands in his, the water rippling around them. The congregation leaned forward slightly as Thomas's voice filled the church, thick with emotion but clear and strong. "Emma, do you accept God's love and the start of a new life?" Emma's voice was small but sure. "I do." Thomas positioned one hand behind her back, the other holding her hands. With gentle care, he lowered her into the water. The congregation held its collective breath. For a moment, Emma was completely submerged, the water flowing over her peacefully. When Thomas raised her up, Emma emerged from the water with a small gasp. Water streamed down her face, but there was something different about her expression, a lightness, as if a weight had been lifted. Her eyes shone with a new brightness. She wiped the water from her face with one hand, drops falling from her eyelashes. Looking up at Thomas, she broke into a genuine smile, the kind that reached all the way to her eyes. "I feel different," she said, wonder in her voice. Thomas couldn't hold back anymore. A sob caught in his throat as he pulled her into a tight hug, not caring that their wet clothes pressed together or that water dripped from both of them. "You are, sweetheart," he choked out, holding her close. "You are." The water lapped gently around them as they embraced, grandfather and granddaughter, both transformed by love and second chances. The afternoon sunlight filtered through the stained glass windows, casting a rainbow of colors across the rippling water of the baptismal pool. The soft sound of applause echoed through the church as Emma stood dripping, her white dress clinging to her small frame. Her dark hair was plastered to her face, but her eyes shone with something new, a quiet peace that hadn't been there before. Thomas reached for a thick, fluffy towel from the nearby rack, his pastor's robe also dripping. With gentle movements, he wrapped the towel around Emma's shoulders, carefully rubbing warmth back into her arms. Droplets of water fell from her eyelashes as she blinked up at him, her expression suddenly serious. "Grandpa," she said, her voice small but clear in the hushed church. "Does this mean I'm really part of your family now?" Thomas felt his heart catch in his throat. He knelt down in the water, not caring that his robe was getting even more soaked. Carefully, he placed his weathered hands on either side of her face, looking directly into those eyes that reminded him so much of Sarah. "Sweetheart, you've always been part of my family," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I just took too long to find you." Emma's face brightened with a smile, not the guarded, hesitant ones she usually gave, but a real, genuine smile that lit up her whole face. Water dripped from her chin as she nodded, understanding flowing between them. Members of the congregation came forward one by one, offering quiet congratulations. Mrs. Johnson from the choir squeezed Emma's hand. "Welcome to the family, dear," she whispered. Mr. Peters, who had attended the church for 30 years, patted Thomas on the shoulder with knowing eyes. From her spot in the front pew, Margaret watched the scene unfold, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. She had seen many children find homes over her years at the orphanage. But this was something special. The healing wasn't just for Emma, it was for Thomas too. Emma's small hand found Thomas's larger one as they made their way down the center aisle. Their footsteps left wet prints on the carpet, but nobody seemed to mind. The wooden doors of the church creaked open, letting in a burst of warm afternoon sunshine. As they stepped outside, Emma took a deep breath of the fresh air. Her wet hair sparkled in the sunlight, and her grip on Thomas's hand tightened just a little. "I think Mommy saw that," she said softly, looking up at the clear blue sky. "I think she's happy." Thomas swallowed hard, his own eyes lifting to the heavens. A gentle breeze rustled through the trees, carrying with it the scent of spring flowers. "I know she is," he whispered, squeezing Emma's hand gently. The moment hung there, perfect and complete, as grandfather and granddaughter stood together in the afternoon sun. Their shadows merged into one on the church steps, their hearts finally at peace. The evening settled softly around Thomas's home, bringing with it a gentle peace. The fireplace crackled and popped, sending warm shadows dancing across the walls. Emma sat curled up on the couch, her hair still slightly damp from the baptism, wearing her favorite fuzzy sweater. Thomas joined her, draping a thick blanket over them both. The events of the day seemed to hang in the air: the baptism, the new beginning, the promises made. Emma fiddled with the edge of her sweater, lost in thought. The firelight caught her face, highlighting features that reminded Thomas so much of Sarah. Suddenly, Emma looked up at him, her eyes curious but cautious. "Did Mommy ever send you letters?" Thomas felt his chest tighten. He knew this conversation would come eventually, but it still caught him off guard. After a moment's hesitation, he nodded slowly. Emma's fingers twisted harder in her sweater. "Did you write back?" The question hit him like a physical blow. Thomas swallowed hard, shame burning in his throat. He shook his head, unable to find words. Emma studied his face for what felt like forever, her young eyes somehow ancient with understanding. "That's really sad, Grandpa," she said simply, but there was no judgment in her voice, only a child's pure observation of pain. Thomas felt a tear slip down his cheek before he could stop it. The weight of all his mistakes, all his failures, seemed to press down on him at once. But then something unexpected happened. Emma reached over and took his hand in her small one, squeezing it gently. "But you're different now, right?" Thomas let out a shaky breath, more tears threatening to fall. "I hope so, sweetheart," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. Emma tilted her head considering this. Then she said something that broke him completely. "I think Mommy would have forgiven you." The tears came freely now. Thomas pulled Emma into his arms, holding her close, whispering, "Thank you," into her hair. She hugged him back fiercely, as if trying to squeeze away all his pain. Later that night, as Thomas tucked Emma into bed, she smiled up at him sleepily. Her eyes were already starting to close, but she managed to murmur, "I love you, Grandpa." For the first time since she'd come into his life, Thomas didn't hesitate or doubt. The words came naturally, filled with all the love he'd held back for too long. "I love you more, baby girl." The autumn afternoon painted the park in shades of gold and amber. Leaves drifted lazily from the trees, creating a natural carpet beneath the old swing set, where Emma kicked her feet toward the sky. Thomas sat on a nearby bench, his hands clasped loosely in his lap, watching his granddaughter with wonder. The past few months felt like both an eternity and a blink of an eye. He remembered the frightened, withdrawn little girl who'd first grabbed his hand at the orphanage. Now, here she was, her laughter mixing with the rustle of falling leaves. Emma's swinging gradually slowed until she was barely moving. Her small fingers gripped the chains as she turned to look at him, her expression suddenly serious. "Grandpa, do you think Mommy would be proud of me?" Thomas's heart squeezed in his chest. He stood up and walked over to her, kneeling down beside the swing. The mulch crunched under his knees as he met her questioning gaze. She'd be the proudest mother in the world. Emma's lips trembled, and before Thomas could say another word, she launched herself off the swing and into his arms. He held her tight, feeling her small shoulders shake slightly. Margaret's familiar footsteps crunched through the leaves as she approached the bench. She watched Emma break away from the hug and dash through a pile of leaves, sending them flying into the air with delighted squeals. "She's changed so much, Thomas," Margaret observed, settling onto the bench beside him. Thomas watched Emma chase after a particularly bright red leaf, her face glowing with joy. "We both have," he admitted quietly. As the afternoon light began to fade, they started their walk home. Emma skipped ahead, then back, finally slipping her small hand into Thomas's. The simple gesture filled his heart with warmth. For the first time since Sarah left, the weight of the past didn't press down on his shoulders. Instead, he felt something new and precious: peace. The morning sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, casting colorful patterns across the wooden pews. Thomas stood behind the pulpit, his hands resting on its smooth surface as he gazed out at the familiar faces of his congregation. The usual confidence that carried him through countless sermons wavered. His eyes found Emma in the front row, clutching her stuffed bear close to her chest. She gave him a small, encouraging smile, and somehow that made all the difference. "Today," Thomas began, his voice steady despite the trembling in his chest, "I want to talk about something I've never had the courage to face. Until now." The rustling of bulletins and quiet whispers fell silent. Every eye focused on him as he continued. "I failed my daughter," he said, the words catching slightly. "I turned my back on her when she needed me most. And because of that, I lost her forever." A few gasps rippled through the congregation. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but Thomas pressed on. "But God gave me a second chance in the form of a little girl who refused to give up on me." His eyes met Emma's again, and he saw tears glistening in her eyes. "I spent years preaching about redemption." Thomas's voice grew thick with emotion, "but I never truly understood it until now." Throughout the sanctuary, people dabbed at their eyes with tissues. Margaret sat straight-backed in her usual spot, nodding with quiet approval. The morning light seemed to grow warmer, softer. As the service drew to a close, Emma bounded up to the pulpit, her stuffed bear swinging from one hand. "That was a really good sermon, Grandpa," she said earnestly. Thomas knelt down to her level, gently brushing a stray curl from her forehead. His heart felt fuller than he could ever remember. The evening shadows lengthened across Thomas's study as the fire crackled softly in the fireplace. Thomas sat at his heavy wooden desk, staring at the worn envelope that had haunted him for years. His fingers trembled as they traced the faded ink of Sarah's handwriting. Emma's quiet footsteps padded into the room. She wore her favorite pajamas, the ones with little stars scattered across them. "Grandpa, what's that?" she asked, curiosity filling her voice. Thomas looked up, his heart catching in his throat. After a moment's hesitation, he patted the chair beside him. "It's from your mommy," he said softly. "She wrote this a long time ago, but I never read it." Emma climbed onto the chair, her small face serious in the firelight. She looked at the envelope, then back at Thomas. Her tiny hand slipped into his larger one. "Maybe we should read it together." Thomas's heart pounded so hard he could barely breathe. With shaking fingers, he carefully opened the envelope, trying not to tear the delicate paper. Sarah's elegant handwriting flowed across the page, and his vision blurred with tears. "Dear Daddy," he read, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if you'll ever read this, but if you do, I just want to say, I forgive you." Thomas's voice cracked. Emma squeezed his hand tighter. "I was angry for a long time, but I never stopped loving you. I hope one day you'll find us." Tears splashed onto the paper. Thomas had to pause, struggling to catch his breath. If you do, please take care of my little girl. She's all I have. And I know deep down she needs you. Love, Sarah. The letter fell from Thomas's trembling hands. A sob tore from his chest as years of guilt and pain finally broke free. Emma wrapped her small arms around him, her voice gentle. She forgave you, Grandpa. Thomas closed his eyes, tears streaming down his face. I love you, baby girl. I'm sorry I was too late. Emma hugged him fiercely, her grip strong and sure. For the first time in years, Thomas felt the heavy weight of guilt begin to lift from his shoulders. Snowflakes danced outside the windows as Christmas lights twinkled throughout Thomas's home. The scent of pine and cinnamon filled the air, and carols played softly in the background. Emma darted around the living room in her red Christmas dress, carefully adjusting ornaments on the tree. Grandpa, look. This one's crooked, she called out, stretching on her tiptoes to fix a silver ball. Thomas watched from the doorway, his heart full of a joy he hadn't felt in decades. Margaret arrived first, carrying a steaming casserole and wearing a festive sweater. Soon after, members of the congregation filed in, bearing gifts and dishes. The house filled with warmth and laughter, sounds that had been absent for far too long. During dinner, Emma chatted excitedly with everyone, her eyes sparkling. Thomas caught Margaret's knowing smile from across the table. She's blooming, Margaret whispered when she passed him the potatoes. After the meal, Thomas pulled out a small wrapped box. Emma, sweetheart, I have something special for you. Emma carefully unwrapped the gift, her small fingers working at the paper. Inside was a delicate silver locket. When she opened it, tears welled in her eyes. There was Sarah's picture, smiling back at her. Now you can keep her close to your heart, Thomas said softly, helping Emma fasten the chain around her neck. Emma threw her arms around his neck, the locket pressed between them. Best Christmas ever, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. As the evening wore on, they gathered around the fireplace singing carols. Emma's clear voice rang out during silent night, though she stumbled over some of the words. Eventually, her head grew heavy, and she curled up against Thomas's shoulder, her breathing becoming slow and steady. The guests departed quietly, leaving Thomas alone with his sleeping granddaughter. Outside, snow continued to fall in gentle waves. Thomas touched the locket around Emma's neck and looked up at the twinkling tree. Merry Christmas, Sarah, he whispered into the peaceful night. We made it. The first morning of 2024 dawned crisp and bright, frost painting delicate patterns on the windows of Thomas's home. Sunlight streamed through the glass, casting warm golden squares across the hardwood floors. The house was quiet except for the gentle humming coming from the kitchen. Emma's eyes fluttered open in her room, now decorated with fairy lights and family photos. She stretched, her stuffed bear tucked under one arm, and breathed in the familiar scent of home. The fear that used to grip her each morning had faded away, replaced by a comfort she'd almost forgotten could exist. Padding down the hallway in her fuzzy socks, Emma followed the sound of humming. She found Thomas in the kitchen, spatula in hand, softly singing Amazing Grace as he flipped pancakes on the griddle. The sight made her smile. It wasn't perfect, some of the pancakes were a little burnt, but it was real. Morning, Grandpa, she said, climbing onto her usual chair at the kitchen table. Thomas turned, his face lighting up. Good morning, sweetheart. Happy New Year. Emma looked around the kitchen, taking in the familiar sight of the worn coffee maker, the magnets on the fridge, the stack of church bulletins on the counter. This house doesn't feel scary anymore, she said thoughtfully. Thomas set a plate of slightly misshapen pancakes in front of her, his eyes soft. That's because it's not just a house. It's home. After breakfast, Thomas pulled out a notepad and 2 pens. I thought we could write down our New Year's resolutions together, he suggested. Do you know what those are? Emma nodded seriously. They're promises you make to yourself for the new year. She took one of the pens, her tongue poking out slightly as she concentrated on writing. Thomas watched as she carefully formed each letter. When she finished, she pushed the notepad toward him. In her childish handwriting, she had written, 2024 goal, be happy with Grandpa. Thomas's chest tightened as he read the simple words. He remembered all the times he'd found her crying in her room, all the nights she'd woken up from nightmares, all the days she'd tested him to see if he'd give up. And now here she was, making happiness her goal. Emma slipped off her chair and walked around the table. She wrapped her arms around him, pressing her face into his shoulder. "I love you, Grandpa." Thomas closed his eyes, holding her close. The guilt and regret that had haunted him for so long finally seemed to lift completely. "I love you more, baby girl." Sunlight filtered through the stained glass windows of Thomas's church, casting rainbow patterns across the wooden pews. The congregation sat in hushed anticipation, their usual Sunday morning chatter falling silent as Thomas approached the pulpit. His steps were steady, measured, though his heart thundered in his chest. Emma sat in the front row, her small hands clasped in her lap, wearing the locket that held Sarah's picture. Her eyes never left Thomas as he adjusted the microphone, straightened his collar, and cleared his throat. "For many years," Thomas began, his voice carrying clearly through the church, "I stood here preaching about forgiveness, but I didn't truly understand it until recently." He paused, letting his gaze sweep across the familiar faces before him. "I thought redemption was something given, but I've learned it's something fought for, something earned." The words seemed to hang in the air, heavy with meaning. Emma's fingers found the locket around her neck, clutching it tightly as she watched her grandfather speak. Her eyes shone with pride and understanding beyond her years. Thomas continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. He spoke of second chances, of love that persists even when we think we've lost everything, of a little girl who taught him more about faith than all his years of preaching ever had. When he finished, a profound silence filled the church. Then, one by one, people began to stand, reaching out to him as he walked past. They embraced him, shook his hand, some with tears in their eyes. Margaret, sitting near the back, nodded approvingly, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. Emma couldn't contain herself any longer. She ran to Thomas, grabbing his hand with both of hers. Her face glowed with joy and pride as she looked up at him. "That was your best one yet, Grandpa." Thomas knelt down to her level, his eyes misting as he gently brushed a stray curl from her forehead. His voice was soft, meant only for her ears. "It was all for you, baby girl." A single line appears on the screen. "Redemption is never too late, and love never truly leaves us." It was all for you, baby girl. If you enjoyed the story of Thomas, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.